Welcome to Frontlines of Social Good, the weekly news and views program from the Philanthropy Mastermind series. I'm Jay Frost. We begin, as always, with the top 5 gifts of the week and a look at the headlines shaping the philanthropic landscape. Then, in our feature interview, we're joined by Sir Stephen Bubb, Executive Director of the Grattan Institute of Charity at the University of Oxford, where I am this week, and one of the UK's most influential voices in philanthropy. We'll talk about the state of charity today, how the sector can meet rising demand, and why he believes bold leadership and fresh thinking are essential for the future of the impact sector in the UK, the US, and beyond. Let's get started. First, as always, the top 5 gifts of the week. Coming in at number 5, a $15 million gift from the Farmer Family Foundation to the Christ Hospital Heart and Vascular Institute in Cincinnati, the largest philanthropic investment in the history of the Christ Hospital Health Network, supporting a new state-of-the-art cardiac operating suite with a broadcast center for real-time surgical education, next-generation imaging tech, and an expanded non-invasive diagnostic capabilities to advance cardiovascular care locally and nationally. Number 4, a $25 million gift from the Duncan Fund to Houston Methodist, renaming its largest department the Houston Methodist Charles W. Duncan Jr. Department of Medicine, and supporting initiatives in personalized and preventive healthcare, AI-driven treatment strategies, complex care coordination, and 5 endowed fellowships, including a new MedTech Innovator Fellowship, advancing the hospital's vision for lifelong patient-centered care. Number 3, a $30 million gift from alumnus Joe C. Wen and family to UCLA, renaming the UCLA School of Nursing as the UCLA Joe C. Wen School of Nursing, the first school at the university named after an Asian American benefactor, and supporting programs for roughly 600 students across all degree levels, advancing diversity in nursing leadership, addressing workforce shortages, and strengthening care for underserved communities. Number 2, a £27 million gift from the Paul Foundation to the University of Oxford to establish the Oxford Center for Emerging Minds Research, advancing mental health outcomes for children, young people, and families through early intervention, prevention strategies, and strengths-based approaches, funding to endowed professorships, and creating an experimental classroom space in Oxford's new Life and Mind building. And coming in at number 1 this week, a gift of 100 million Australian dollars from Perth businessman Ted Powell to Murdoch University, the largest donation in Western Australia's history, to rebuild the university's veterinary school, expand annual veterinary student enrollment by nearly 50%, and create world-class facilities, inspired in part by his late wife's passion for cats and his commitment to giving back to the community. Have we missed a big gift announcement this week? I'm sure that we have. Let us know by contacting me directly through LinkedIn or by email at j@DonorSearch.net. Now, here are some of the top stories in the impact sector around the world this week. First, according to Stat News and Reuters, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has announced a landmark $2.5 billion commitment through 2030 to accelerate research and development in women's health. This is the largest such pledge in Foundation's history. The focus is on areas where investment has historically been scarce, including preeclampsia, menopause, endometriosis, menstrual health, and maternal and sexual health services. The initiative will fund more than 40 innovations, ranging from AI-powered ultrasound technology to next-generation contraceptive methods. Dr. Anita Zaidi, who heads the Foundation's Gender Equality Division, said the aim is to transform women's health by closing research gaps that have left millions without effective diagnosis or treatment. The Foundation notes that female-specific conditions currently receive just a fraction of global health R&D funding, sometimes as little as 1% outside of cancer research. Meanwhile, as first detailed by Matt Watkins of Watkins Public Affairs on his LinkedIn feed, an executive order signed on August 7th, which is entitled Improving Oversight of Federal Grant-Making, is poised to dramatically change how the U.S. federal government awards grants, including to nonprofits. Under this order, Every agency must have a senior political appointee approve new grant announcements, and those appointees are instructed not to defer to existing review panels, but instead apply their own judgment. The order bans funding for programs involving racial preferences, services for undocumented immigrants, or initiatives that treat sex as mutable. It also allows agencies to terminate grants, quote, for convenience, end quote, if political priorities shift midstream. Applications will have to be written in what they describe as plain language. Projects must align directly with presidential priorities, and preference will go to applicants with lower indirect cost rates. Supporters argue that changes will prevent waste and duplication, while critics see a politicization of grant making that weakens independent review and will narrow the scope of public investment in research, education, and community services. More on this as it develops. There's also a renewed scrutiny on billionaire philanthropy this week. A new report from the Institute of Policy Studies, or Institute for Policy Studies, I should say, covered by the nonprofit Times, marks the 15th anniversary of the Giving Pledge, launched by Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. Of the 57 billionaires who signed in 2010, most remain billionaires today, collectively worth about $908 billion, an increase of more than 280% in assets since they took the pledge. The report estimates they've given around $206 billion to charity since the start of the pledge, but nearly 80% of that has gone into private foundations, where funds can sometimes sit for years before reaching active nonprofits. Another small share has gone into donor-advised funds, which similarly allow for delayed distribution. Only Laura and John Arnold have fully met their pledge while living, and just 8 of the 22 deceased pledgers gave away half their wealth before their death. Researchers warn that the pattern points to a growing concentration of philanthropic power in, quote, dynastic foundations, where wealth is preserved, tax benefits are immediate, but public benefit can be slow in arriving. And finally, here in the UK, we mark the passing of Dame Stephanie, or Steve, Shirley, as reported by The Guardian and many other publications here where I am in the UK. Arriving in Britain at age 5 on the Kinder transport, she built a life from scratch, eventually founding Freelance Programmers in 1962 with just 6 British pounds in capital. At a time when married women often couldn't keep their jobs, she recruited and trained hundreds of women, working from home with telephones, pencils, and flowcharts, to produce software for major clients, including the Concorde Project's black box recorder. Her company grew into a multi-billion-pound enterprise, and in later years, she sold her controlling stake to employees, making dozens of them millionaires. Inspired by the needs of her autistic son, she became one of the UK's foremost philanthropists and advocates for philanthropy, especially in autism research and care, funding residential programs, schools, and national research initiatives. She also endowed the Oxford Internet Institute and gave millions to technology and education causes. Honored as a Dame in 2000 and a Companion of Honor in 2017, Dame Shirley leaves a legacy of innovation, generosity, and a determination to make her success matter. All of which brings us to our feature conversation today, fittingly from right here in Oxford, with one of the UK's most influential voices in charity and philanthropy. Sir Stephen Bubb is the founding executive director of the Grattle Institute of Charity at the University of Oxford. Over several decades, he has advised governments at home and abroad, led the Association of Chief Executives of Voluntary Organizations for as many as 16 years, founded the European Third Sector Leaders Network, Euclid, and conducted national reviews on NHS reform and the treatment of people with learning disabilities. He's the only charity leader ever to have addressed the full British cabinet. Today, we'll talk about the state of charity in the UK, the challenge it faces, and his vision for the future. Here is that conversation.
Sure.
Thank you, Sir Stephen, for being here and talking with me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you at another location close to where I'm sitting right now. But you've been affiliated with this university for a long time. Since when?
Well, I was at Christ Church reading politics, philosophy, and economics in 1972, which is some time ago. But obviously, and I have a brother and various nephews also been through Oxford, so I have a deep affection for the university and Oxford as a town.
It's a lovely town, and the university has such history. And if you were to study those subjects, I suppose read those subjects at a different time, one might come to different conclusions. I'm curious. You've spent now your career in this world of, among many things, public sector things or third sector activities, and we'll be talking about that today. But I wonder what it must have been like to read those subjects and then enter this world.
Well, the interesting thing is reflecting back. So, I was reading politics, I was reading economics, and very little attention paid to the role of the broad third sector. I'm very interested in history, and a little later in life, I took some time off to write a history of charity because in Britain, because there isn't actually anything there. There are two main studies of philanthropy in Britain, both written by Harvard professors, as it happens, but they date back to the 60s. It's very interesting. This is a very neglected academic area of study, and when we were talking about establishing the institute, we did do a survey of British universities in terms of what academic study there is of charity, and it's minimal, despite the fact that this is a country that has 1,600 years worth of charity experience, which has given charity law to many countries around the world, which is fundamental to how we operate our democracy in this country, and people pay little attention to it.
I was hoping you might talk about that when in visiting Oxford, taking a tour of the libraries, for example, you're introduced to all the various people who have made the library possible. The footprint of those people over time is really quite extraordinary. It's not just the government, which has been instrumental in supporting institutions like Oxford and others, but it's all these donors. So to not have a history of that is curious.
Yeah.
When you've done that work yourself, and then others have contributed to that scholarship over time, is there a kind of a through line between some of those early donors and what's going on today?
Well, I think when you look at the history of charity in this country, you sort of move from a time when basically what we now see as a sort of welfare system was entirely provided by charities, and charities were really an arm of the state. So there was no sort of idea of an independent sector. They were part of the state. And you move gradually to a situation where charities start becoming the voice of the poor, of advocacy. They start developing a professional cadre of staff, and a very gradual development. And what's interesting, because we're in New College, which was founded in 1379 by a massive philanthropic donation from the Bishop of Winchester, who gave money to establish the college and the chapel. And that philanthropic gift continues to give, because the endowment that he gave continues to fund our college life. So we are, as a college, a charity, and many universities, Oxford colleges themselves are charities. So it is a puzzle, isn't it, that there is so little academic study of charity.
Except, I guess, in kind of the popular media, often now one might see a debate about a certain donor or their careers or how they made their wealth, and then when they gave, and also how those people are honored. Is that something that you see bubbling up in your work over the last few years, and the same way we have in the States?
Yes, every so often. And people have different views. I mean, at one level, people think, well, at least the money is now doing good, even if it came from suspect source, and others who take a much purer view about, well, we're not going to touch money from tyrants, from people who've been responsible for human rights abuses. I think there's a fine line, frankly, in terms of donors and their money. But the key thing about our institute was that we wanted to look at how you run charities, about how you make them more effective and efficient, because there is actually more academic study of philanthropy. So, for example, in the States, there are institutes that look at philanthropy. So there's been more study. There are books on giving. But what there is little of is academic research and study and teaching around how do you run a more effective charity? What's the impact of a charity? How do you get a better charity? How do you increase the impact? So what I found, for me, what drove the establishment of this institute was that my 16 years running the organisation that represented charity chief executives, I saw how weak the infrastructure of charities are. I saw how weak governance is, how leadership development is, and it's purely because they don't have the money to support that development. And donors often say, well, I want my money to go to the front line. I don't want it spent on infrastructure. So, I mean, it's a ridiculous position, because if you want an efficient charity, if you're interested in impact, you should be interested in effective infrastructure. So the idea you just give your money to the front line and someone else pays for the electricity bills and the rent and the staff salaries is absurd. So that was one of the drivers for me of establishing this institute.
And I realize we just touched on two places that are at kind of different points in your professional life, both of which have had a pretty significant impact. You were just referencing Akivo. So for those unfamiliar with that in the States, would you mind telling us both how you became involved in it, but also really its primary purposes and what you were doing there at that time?
It was Akivo is the national professional body representing charity chief executives. So it was there as a voice, collective voice for charity chief executives, working with government, a voice in terms of the media. So I had to do a lot of media work. Whenever there was a scandal in a charity, there was a row about why are charity chief executives paid. I'd be the person out there saying, of course, charity chief executives are paid. How on earth do you think they're run? So that was a big role, but also working with government. We had 2,000 members, mainly the bigger national charities. So it was what I did, which I did for 16 years. We had some very interesting times through the Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron years. So I knew them all. I worked with them on promoting the sector. And I think, a key point to make is in terms of the political systems in America and the UK, charities in this country work much more closely with government because we have a unitary political system. So the national government is the key. It's not a federal system. So charities have to be more involved with government. And also, I think that sort of the differences in philanthropy as well, the difference in history and culture actually make a difference. So.
Could you share a little bit about that? I realize you could talk about that for 2 days, but maybe just starting with that piece about the connection and maybe the differences between the US and the UK in terms of the relationship of charitable organizations to government. Because we're having that debate, of course, right now, as you and I speak, there are more directives coming from the federal administration in the U.S. about funding for charities and if they have to be inclined to be supportive of certain federal positions and so forth.
Yes. I've been watching that with a sort of horror, really. One thing I think there's a much more settled view in this country in government and policymakers is that charities are independent and have a right to express opinions And actually, you need to listen to charities if you're developing policy. So there's no point in telling a charity, no, shut up, we don't want to hear your view, you have to reflect the view of the government. Because if you want to develop policy on mental health, on homelessness, what you need are the charities who work in those areas to tell you, what's the solution? What's the answer? What are you doing wrong? And the very first third sector minister in this country was Ed Miliband, and he famously said to us, he said, "You must bite the hand that feeds you." So it's an interesting idea because, of course, many charities are contracted to deliver services. In mental health, for example, in this country, about a third of all services are delivered through charities by contract with the state. And that's done purely because A, those charities know better how to work with people with mental health issues, and B, they're more cost effective. They're efficient, cost effective. So it's a good deal for the charity, for their beneficiaries and for the state. So there's a much better, I think, understanding of the relationship, and that is based on respect for the views that a charity will have. And sometimes, government ministers will get a bit fed up with some mouthy chief executive saying you got it all wrong, but they just have to be mature and sit back and say, well, yeah, that's the point of view. But it is important, and the growth of charities in the last 2 centuries has been interesting in that policy development area. Because in the 19th century, much of the socially progressive legislation was driven by charities. So the legislation on child abuse, on the abuse of animals, was driven by charities. And without them, well, in fact, the emancipation of slaves, all of that legislation, again, was driven by charity and voluntary organizations. So that they often act as sort of the conscience of citizens in a way that sometimes the political parties can't do. But I think also the other thing in terms of the US and our system is it's not a federal system. So here, central government does decide everything. We have local government, but basically they act within what the central government tells them to do. So our attention in terms of advocacy, policy making is always with the central government. Interestingly, our current government, about a third of all cabinet ministers have actually worked in charities.
Really?
Yeah. My deputy at Kiva, is a very good guy, is the cabinet secretary for science and technology. So there's a sort of a real understanding of the power and importance of the sector. More importantly, as well, it's not just the question of understanding the sector, is how do you utilize the skill, the experience, and the power of charities to deliver your main policy objectives. So social cohesion, communities, economic growth. You need to enlist the power of those organizations. You can't these days, it's not possible for the state to deliver everything. You've got to work in partnership.
I wonder if that also means that they do that either because of or maybe in spite of the fact that, as you said before, that their role is to bite the hand that feeds them. I mean, if you rely on the services to be provided by the organizations, not just what they know, but also what they deliver, does the fact that they have then a friendly but adversarial relationship actually mean more progress?
I think it does. And I think what I saw when I was at Akiva was that charity chief executives have got very good at managing that balance, the sort of sometimes the tightrope between working inside government and then being critical. So it's, I mean, I had to do this as their spokesperson. So, I mean, I could be very forthright myself about when the government was going wrong. But it was an important part of, I think if you don't speak up, then you get steamrolled.
Yeah.
What I found in terms of my relationship with government was that they would often want to work with me, would want me on side, but they would know if I was really pissed off, I would say so. And they did not want to be in that position because I get the front page of the newspapers.
Wow. Okay. Well, there's a whole conversation right there because, and of course, third sector organizations in the U.S., or what we typically call our nonprofits or impact sector,
Yeah.
don't often get a lot of press coverage. But before we go there, because I'm sure you'll have something to say about that as well, before we go there, for those in the U.S. who listen to this or see this, they may, again, not be aware not only of the differences in governance structure, but also the fact that in the UK, it's still rough and tumble. You have Labour and you have the Tories, and then you have others too. It's not just two parties. And people really do engage in ideas in a pretty vigorous way. So, and you've been able to talk and work with and been affiliated with both parties, I believe. Is it correct?
Yeah.
Parties. So does that make a difference in this whole equation of working with the nonprofit or the third sector?
Yeah, I mean, because in the time I was there, we moved from the Labour, Blair, Brown years to a coalition under David Cameron, and I know at the beginning of the Cameron premiership there was a slight tension, if you like, around these charities have all been very pally with the Blair team, but actually they soon got used to the fact that actually these people are very useful and part of, and I've had conversations with David Cameron on these issues. So I mean the point was I was always the advocate for charities. Full stop. I wasn't.
And that's probably a good place to segue because, again, before your current work, you did work, I guess, within government as well. Is that correct? To advise them on some of these issues?
No, I did. Well, I did two national inquiries actually for the government. I did a big inquiry on the abuse of people with learning disabilities, and I did an inquiry on the role of our non-profits in healthcare. Both fascinating inquiries, both reports accepted by government, and then very little has happened.
What? Oh, well, we can't leave that there. What? So, and I'm sure that that's a feeling that many people have when you're working really deeply within the sector, whether you're doing a report. I mean, we've had that, of course, in the States from the Filer Commission to the Generosity Commission, but this is more deep than that, I know. So once that report is delivered, and I'm sure it's received with interest, what is the difficulty in application? Is it because we aspire to be higher than a temporary government can implement, or is it that they are only half interested in the solutions that come from our sector?
Well, so the report on learning disability, the key recommendation I made was to close the institutions that that currently housed, it was about 2,500 people. Institutions that I found were basically abusive. And the recommendations were accepted. In fact, when it was reported in the House of Commons, was David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at the time, said he accepted those recommendations and would implement them. But still to this day, there are still 2,000 people in institutions. There are still institutions there. I mean, it's very difficult to know why that hasn't happened. But I think it's the divide between the political will and a clear intent to close the institution with the bureaucracy itself. So although I had the political buy-in, the institutional buy-in was opposed to what I was doing. it was too easy to put people with learning disabilities into those institutions and too difficult to put them into community care. It's still an ongoing debate, and I think that at some stage it will happen. But it was a fascinating, it's always very fascinating to do these things. When I did my report on non-profits in the health sector, I became the first sector leader to address a meeting of the British Cabinet. I was given 2 minutes to talk to them. That itself, in the cabinet room, that in itself is a rather fascinating experience.
What was that like for you? And especially after you've worked very hard and long on something, you know you can answer any question, but you've only got 120 seconds.
Well, exactly. Well, I'll tell you, it was a formative experience for me because up to the morning of that cabinet meeting, I'd been really heavily busy with tying up the ends, etc. And I remember thinking, I've got this bloody speech to make. God knows what I'm going to say, right? And I went to bed because I was exhausted. I woke up early. I went into the garden. And I said, okay, look, what are the key words, right? And I put 10 words down on a piece of paper, and I spoke to them, and it was 2 minutes. And I'll tell you, it was incredibly effective. I mean, I was told by cabinet ministers I knew how effective it was, and it just goes to show you can, I could have spent hours preparing a speech, writing it down and delivering it, and it would have been ineffective. But actually, I was speaking completely from my knowledge, from my heart. I knew what the key messages were, and I got them across. So ever since then, I've never prepared a speech. I've always done it on the basis, the 10 words, the 5 words I want to go, and then you speak to them.
I'm wondering with something like that, especially because there was a lot of work and a big study, and that study must have been substantial for them to read. If in the end, it was the opportunity to sit with people, talk to them eye to eye, and speak from the heart. And since you were the first to do that, is that a model or something that we can aspire to, whether it's here in the UK or in the US or otherwise, to advocate for positions where the third sector can and should lead?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the recent work that we did in the Gradle was we commissioned a report from economists, including a Bank of England economist, on the actual size of the British third sector. Our statistics are very, very weak here, weak, incomplete, and as a result, you would think this is a very small sector. But in fact, if you do the work properly, if you include the economic impact of volunteering, you get to a figure of at least 100 billion. And in fact, some economists think that the effects of volunteering in the economy could mean there's a contribution of up to 200 billion to the economy. And when you start thinking about that, you start thinking, well, blimey, this is an important sector. And that's a message that we're trying to get across. Think of this sector as a vehicle for reforming public services, as for developing economic growth, and for social cohesion. And at the meeting we had when we were discussing this report, one of the powerful contributions was around economic growth is built on social stability, social cohesion. So if you're trying inward investment into a country, one of the things that investors will look at is how stable the country is. What's that social structure looking like? So, for example, if after the recent there were a number of riots around a stabbing. Now, if that had really taken off and the place was, there were riots everywhere, that would have put off investors. But it's also more important than that, because what's happened in the years of austerity in many communities is many of the small local charities that do work in youth clubs, for example, with children, many of them have had their funding either cut or disappeared, and that leaves a big gap. And that's contributed to some of our problems around mental health, long-term sickness. So social cohesion is important, and that's a really important job for our third sector.
I'm wondering about that, as we compare and contrast different systems between the U.S. and the U.K., but just thinking about it more broadly, we have studies in the U.S. From Edelman about trust, for example, how trust has eroded, and that's a contributor to this discussion about social cohesion. But we can also go back to, I know before it, but certainly to Robert Putnam's work about bowling alone and all the work that's been done since. So we have this debate all the time too. But I'm wondering, do we find that some of the challenges to what the nonprofit sector, to the third sector, are doing to try, intentionally or unintentionally, to provide social cohesion, are we more challenged today in some respects than we might have been when you began your career? And if so, what are the challenges today, and how can we help to overcome them and build a more cohesive society through our sector?
I mean, I think my observation would be that the pandemic was fairly, it's disastrous in many respects, but it made a big dent in volunteering. So the research we did seems to indicate there's something like a 37% decrease in volunteering since the pandemic. Now, that's not good, but also we've had a decade of austerity, of significant cuts in spending by government, and often those cuts are at the what is seen as the marginal end, the sort of the youth club funding. It's that's gone. So it's always a struggle for charities. Funding for charities is always a struggle.
Is that harder now? I mean, is the struggle for funding, which I know is just one aspect of this, but it's a big one, especially for our audience, is it harder to raise those funds today?
Yes, but of course the other issue in terms of the differences between our two systems is your ultra net worth individuals are much more generous. Our rich people think if they buy a raffle ticket, they're being generous. But in terms of the sort of the big gifts, I'm afraid we fall far behind the United States.
Why is that?
I think it's partly the reflection that we have a well-developed welfare system. So, less well-developed now, but there was the concept after the war that the state provides the welfare system, not charities. And that's a good thing. We have a national health service. These are good things, but it does mean that I think that's the big difference.
Well, I wonder about that in terms of some of the efforts that have been made to raise funds, for example, here at the university, or within other parts of the sector. I think it was a couple of decades ago now, there were modifications made to tax treatment of state gifts, so that people could make gifts of stock and receive a better tax treatment than they had been able to before. So I don't know if the government, whether it's one party or the other in charge, if things are getting easier for charities. And maybe another question, especially for our fundraisers, would be: are fundraisers doing what they need to do in order to build those relationships and solicit the support of people and help them to understand that it's wonderful to buy a lottery ticket, but they could probably do more and have greater impact if they did more?
Yes, and there are exceptions. There are some very generous British donors. Chris Gradle, who is the donor who has enabled the Gradle Institute of Charity, is a brilliant example. He's contributed to the building of the new Gradle Quadrangle at New College, and is funding our institute. So there are exceptions. There are people who get it, and And obviously, the role of fundraisers is to try and, find those individuals who do understand the power of philanthropy. But by and large, it's more difficult, I think, in this country. It's a shame. I mean, we've got some very rich people, celebrities, etc., who I think should be opening their purses wider.
Well, maybe one thing we can talk about there is something that we talked about briefly before we went live, and that's the power of the third sector to deliver on growth, which isn't always just about asking people for money for endowments, although that can be very, very transformational, or to support a program to sustain the infrastructure or the operating expenses. That's also very impactful. But there is more. And I know that you've worked on this not just in the third sector, but across the whole society. So what are your thoughts on how maybe our folks in the third sector can have more vigorous, successful institutions without just relying on maybe one or two channels of financial support? How can we help them grow?
So one of the issues we uncovered in our work on the power of the sector to contribute to economic growth is that the government's procurement program, when they procure goods and services from either the private or the third sector, is heavily geared to the private sector because of scale. So interestingly, something like 350 billion pounds of the public procurement, most of that goes to the private sector. Only, I think, about 25 billion goes to charities. Now, that's very interesting to me, because what we know in terms of the public services, that charities are the best providers of mental health services, rehabilitation services, care services, for example, because these are organisations that have a much greater depth of knowledge of the issues, largely because many of their trustees and staff are people who have experienced the issues, and they have a very effective, strong impact. So it seems strange that you have that. You have a system that favours the private sector. Rehabilitation, for example, this is a good example, because at the moment, Britain's prisons are full, and they've been having to release people early because they're full. Now, what we know, one of the problems is there is a revolving door in prisons. Now, I don't know what the statistics are, but many people who've been in prison end up back in prison because there's no effective rehabilitation. What you need is to work with people coming out of prison in terms of all of the issues that got them into prison in the first place, working towards getting them into paid employment and the like. Now, charities have a superb record in those services, probably the best to do with it, because they're working. There's a matter. You mentioned trust. There's a matter of trust, isn't it? Are you going to, if you're an ex-con coming out of prison, are you going to trust the state service,
which just put you in there?
Charity, right?
Right.
So and yet a minute proportion of the procurement goes to those charities. So really, what you should be doing is ramping up the support for those charities, saying to those charities, "Okay, give us your business plans. Let's ramp them up." And when you think of economic growth, for every person that a charity rehabilitates, gets them back into a house, for example, so they're not on the street, deals with mental health, drug addiction, gets them into a job. If they're in a job, they're then making a net contribution to the economy, whereas those that don't receive that, so to go back into prison, are making a minus contribution. So in terms of economic growth, it's an obvious thing to do. Mental health again. There's a real problem of young people out of work, and a significant issue around mental health. Well, in this country, our job centres, they're okay, but you wouldn't trust your job centre to get a young person back into work. I mean, they're just hopeless. But charities know how to do that. At a different level, something like a third of all medical research is carried out either by charities themselves or funded by charities. But no one thinks of them like that. People think the medical research is carried out by the state, by the NHS. Well, actually, it isn't. And some of the real important breakthroughs. So the first COVID vaccine, of course, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, part of that was funded through charity funding. So again, it's how these organisations make a contribution to the growth of an economy, as well as the healthy well-being of society generally.
If you were making a 2-minute speech to today's cabinet, and maybe you're doing that next week, I don't know, but if you were to do that and talk about this subject, about how some kind of small investment in this sector can lead to economic growth, not just to doing good things and doing them well, but also to growth, which I think every country seeks. What would that 2-minute speech be?
Well, first of all, reforming the procurement program so you make it absolutely, proactively supporting charities, and ramping up the social investment funds and some sort of national resilience fund that supports charities to expand on their business plans. But underpinning that, I think, a cultural shift that moves from thinking, oh, charities are lovely and they're full of lovely people and we do like volunteering, to, oh my goodness, these are important partners in delivering growth.
Yes, and that has to do with something else we touch on just very briefly, which is public perceptions guided by many things, the experiences we have, what we read, but also what is covered in the media. And we get some coverage in the US, but it's usually when something has gone wrong. Yeah. Not always, but usually. I don't know if you're finding the same to be the case in the UK, but have you found ways or discussed with people or studied through Gradell with your team ways to ensure that the coverage, the public understanding through the coverage of our sector is one that is fair, is accurate, but also emphasizes the realities of the impact that we can and do have?
That was always an important part of my job when I ran Akiva, and I got quite good at the media side of things. So you need spokespeople who are proactive in terms of their media exposure, and I'm trying to do the same in Gradell. So using the recent report we produced, I've been doing some media around that. You're completely right. The funny thing is that the origin of the Gradell Institute came about because of a bad news story. So a big charity in the UK, the Kids Company, went bust. Ooh. And it was quite a well-known charity run by a rather charismatic chief executive. So it was big news. And I was asked to do a piece on the main news program, on the lessons to be learned. So I gave them a bit about, the problem is in charities, no one invests in leadership and trustee governance development. And listening to that in a car park was the chap who ran the philanthropy program for a big hedge fund, got in touch, said, you're completely right, what should we do about it? And the two of us then set up Charity Futures, which led to the establishment of the Gradell Institute. So that was a good news story emerging out of a bad news story.
So with the Gradell Institute now, where are you today? And then where do you envision it going? Because having the ability to do that within Oxford is pretty special. As you said before, even talking about the history of philanthropy, which is just one tiny facet of everything we've discussed, it's these two Harvard professors that wrote a book on it, but there's so much opportunity to discuss it here, even by just looking around and saying who funded this or what is the impact of the sector tomorrow. What do you imagine Gradell will do as you move forward?
Well, I was always determined that if we were doing something, it would be at Oxford. and not just because of my my own connections, but Oxford is rated as one of the top universities globally. So you're making a statement by establishing an institute of charity in one of our top universities, and I think that in itself, I think, makes people think, oh right, perhaps this is something we should be looking at. So I was determined that it was in Oxford, but I mean we are still relatively new. I mean, I had to spend, I suppose, 5 years sort of in the preparation and the advocacy for the institute, and then setting it up. We managed to appoint Professor Frumpkin, who comes from Pennsylvania, who's got quite a name in the States in sort of literature around giving. So he's been with us for 2 years. He's developed our research team. We've now got 12 people on the research team, so it's growing, but obviously still very much at the beginning of the journey. I'm hoping that as we grow, we could also move into teaching. So at the moment, it's very much research and influencing policy, for example, with government. But I would hope at some stage we could start developing teaching, postgraduate, even graduate teaching. But that requires big funding. Funnily enough, I have actually been chatting to a fundraiser in America. I said, could he find me 300 million to fund a program, postgraduate development? I think, an MSc in charity, perhaps even one day a BA in charity. I mean, you can study all sorts of things at undergraduate level, but you can't study charity,
Which is a huge part of our daily life. It's not just our intellectual interest.
Right.
So you've been doing this a long time. You're going to continue doing it for a long time, especially after establishing this institute. You've also had all these, not just the work that you've done within the UK, but globally. And you've just referenced several times people from the United States who are, I guess, in some sense partners, at least intellectual academic partners, if not full partners in the work. Do you have any kind of thoughts about where we are across the pond in terms of the issues that we're contending with for the sector? Any words of wisdom or caution?
I think the speaking truth to power. I mean, hold on to that concept. Don't be bullied. I think the idea of a compliant non-profit sector, doing the will of a government is, in my view, abhorrent. And it would be a shame if, I've seen, for example, what's happening to Harvard. I think these things are bad, and not just bad for the States. It's the example being set for other countries, which is bad. So truth to power is key. It's quite interesting. When I was doing my work on the history of charity, I discovered that one of the fundamental bedrocks of the legal system in this country was the 1601 Statute of Elizabeth. It was the first time the government had tried to sort of say, well, what are charitable purposes? And my understanding is that this piece of legislation was one of the few pieces of legislation that wasn't revoked by the newly established government in America after the Revolution. So they swept away a lot of the old English laws, but kept that one. So the sort of bedrock of our laws is actually in the same place, which I think is interesting.
Knowing a bit of history is very helpful to understanding not just the past, but where we're going into the future. Yes.
Yes.
So much for all of this. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Sir Stephen for sharing his insights in the world of contemporary charity and philanthropy and our study of it. We will now be taking our summer break on the Philanthropy Mastermind series. Please join us again the week of August 25th for the next editions of this show, Frontlines of Social Good, as well as How to Raise, our CFRE accredited series for fundraising training, and the PM podcast, the personal views on people who are leaders and thought leaders in the world of social good, which you can also listen to wherever you like to listen. In the meantime, you can enjoy our past programs at the site of our longtime sponsor, DonorSearch, the global leader in AI-powered solutions and prospect research for the fundraising world at DonorSearch.net. Until next time, take care and do good.